Well, hello everyone. Welcome aboard Titanic again. This is going to, well, to start, I lied earlier. I said there would only be one part left of our tour. But upon further analysis of the various things we have left to do, there are too many things to see in first class for this to be accomplished all in one video, so I'm going to split first class into two. And you're also probably thinking, much like when we started in second class, that this does not look like a particularly luxurious space. Where are we? Well, I wanted to start here because this is something I completely forgot existed in one of the earlier parts. This is the funnel uptake casing. This is a fiddly vent above the boiler rooms, and we can step in here, and we're immediately in this very strange looking space with a big tube going through it. This is the funnel uptake. So smoke from the boiler rooms is exhausted up through here and out through the funnel. And if I step onto this platform, I can look up, and there you have it. There is the forward funnel hanging kind of directly over us. But we can now head down and in the direction of first class, which I'm sure is what a lot of people will remember from the various lesser known Titanic media that exists. And step out back onto the cruise passage. To get there, the loading screen here. We're going to go past other entrances to the boiler rooms and the drying rooms and things, because here on Scotland Road, the crew in third class passage, there's this emergency door, and this emergency door, ignore this is another loading screen that, of course, is showing things we haven't made it to yet, unfortunately. The first class level is the most extensive of this entire program, and as a result it takes the longest amount of time to load. But it does load eventually, I promise. Alright, here we are. This is the E-deck landing of the forward grand staircase, but before we get too caught up moving further up, we're going to go down here to F-deck. Because, in addition, well, there's some crew spaces down that hallway that, well, I don't think we can actually get into any of them, so we'll just ignore that. We can step through this door. Ah, see? It's always showing things off before I want to. So this is the Turkish bath cooling room. There was, in Edwardian England predominantly, this was kind of less of a common recreation in the United States, but there was a very precise process affiliated with the Turkish baths, as they were known. You could find these on ships and ashore in the Edwardian era and the periods immediately before and after it, and I don't fully understand a lot of the things they would do in here, but it was extremely popular with wealthy folks from the British Isles. So in here, this is actually the last step in the Turkish bath process, where you would come to cool off after your time in the temperate rooms, which we'll see in a minute. But this room is notable because it is the most well-preserved room we've so far visited in the wreck of Titanic. This room flooded very slowly, and as a result, the flooring, the tiles on the walls, the ceiling, and even some of the light fixtures, and some of the furniture is all very well preserved in here. because it wasn't destroyed by a rapidly flooding space. It filled very slowly, very early in the sinking. Through here is the electric bath, which is weird. I don't know why they came up with this, but it's essentially a giant tin can full of light bulbs, and you would lay in here and supposedly it would do something, although no one seems to know precisely what they thought it was it did. The closest thing that I can think of today would be a tanning bed, but it doesn't tan you because it's not ultraviolet, or whatever it is they use in tanning beds. Is it ultraviolet? Whatever the sun does, this doesn't do that, if that makes any sense. But this was popular aboard Olympic, so they installed one here aboard Titanic. Next door, there's 2 shampooing rooms, which is a little bit ominous looking, but you would sort of get bathed by someone in here. You can see how this rapidly became less popular with Americans. We tend to be more squeamish than Europeans, and this was not quite as relaxing of an experience if you were in America. There were 2 of these rooms. And then through here is the temperate room, which sort of, it's a warm space. It would be kept very warm, and whether or not the interior decor in here actually looked like this is unclear, but warm color motifs obviously feed back into that. The hot room is in here, which would be kept even warmer, and then next door to that is the steam room, effectively the sauna. So all of this entire Turkish bath facility is effectively the ancestor of a modern cruise ship spa. It very directly evolved into that. Through here, though, there's this corridor, linen storage, steward call buttons, more watertight doors. We can't get to the other side of these doors because both of these watertight doors in the wreck are closed, like this one. So this corridor and here, the swimming pool, are inaccessible to ROVs, divers on the wreck. But this is the plunge bath. It was not the first swimming pool on a ship. Obviously, Olympic had one, Titanic's elder sister, and a few other German liners had plunge baths. I think the German ones, I wouldn't really call them a pool per se. It was basically just a large bathtub filled with seawater. But this water in here was heated seawater. We can get in the pool here. So to get a look at the nice tiling in here, the daylight streaming in from the portholes above. This space was open at different times for men and women. Another artifact of the time. There's a couple of survivors that very fondly remember using this. This was the most popular step in the Turkish bath process among Americans because we like swimming, we just don't like any of the other weird stuff in the Turkish bath tradition, I guess you could say. We can move right along here, back into the main stairwell. Yep, see, again, it's showing things off early. I feel like a superior loading screen style might be just freeze framing on whatever it was you were looking at earlier. But it matters less if you're not showing things to people. Again, this is the longest of the loading screens. Alright, so we're back on F deck, just like we were. I'm gonna head back up to E deck. The E deck landing here, there's an electrical panel popped open there so you can see. This indicates, as you can see, that as we were heading west, or as the ship was heading west, at midnight each night, as they passed through multiple time zones across the Atlantic, the clocks had to be adjusted throughout the crossing, and that was done from the bridge. There was a master clock that would control all the rest of the clocks on board, but the clock will be set backward at midnight, 49 minutes. The E-deck landing of the staircase, we can pull into this little well here and look up. These textures load in there for a moment. There's a hint where we'll eventually end up. But we're staying here on E-deck for a moment because Margaret Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown, for years, people thought her cabin was up on C-deck, which is a space that first-class cabins will get to. There's elevator foyers here, and here is a watertight door panel with the crank in that little box, and you'd take your crank out and close the door on the deck below. Which actually might be one of the swimming pool watertight doors, I think. In the bath complex, certainly. But Molly Brown remembers poking her head out of her cabin door and watching stewards crank closed a watertight door. Well, there wasn't any place on C-deck where that would have been possible, and there's only a handful of first-class cabins with a direct line of sight to one of these panels. Most of them we have listed occupants for, so they couldn't have been Margaret Brown, but there was one cabin where that wasn't the case, where we didn't know who was in it, and it had a direct line of sight, and it's right here, E23. So, historians are fairly confident, not 100%, but fairly confident that this cabin was the one that the unsinkable Molly Brown stayed in during the crossing. It's not a very big one. Certainly not as opulent as her cabin is portrayed in the movie. But it would certainly be comfortable for a couple of days. They've got a Pullman bunk up here that you can fold down and actually bunk 3 people in this room. But I believe she was traveling... Well, she wasn't traveling alone, but she was booked a room by herself. So we can carry on up. A little bit of stutter in this level. First class is by far the most demanding. We can head up to D-deck and the D-deck reception room, which was one of the most popular rooms on the ship for passengers. This served as a gathering spot ahead of and immediately after dinner. Passengers would come down from their cabins above, or below, I guess, come down or up these stairs. This magnificent candelabra here. Here's a reproduction of the French tapestry that was at the foot of the stairs. You can see all of the stitching and everything here. But they would serve tea and coffee in here, and there would be a little setup for the orchestra to play around this Steinway Model D, or maybe Model B. Either way, it's a Steinway grand piano. Harlan and Wolff Artisans did all of the gold inlay in the side of the instrument. When Steinway delivers it, it's just plain, but the shipyard did all the decorating on that piano there. But on Olympic, this room was slightly smaller, and so many people would stay in here for so long after dinner, just enjoying themselves and listening to the orchestra, that they ran out of chairs, and in order to prevent passengers from just sitting on the steps, stewards had to bring chairs down from the C-deck landing above. So here on Titanic, they made this room slightly larger to try to accommodate the extra demand. On either side of the D-deck reception here were these boarding entrance foyers, which you can see there's 2 gangway doors with wrought iron sliding gates here. Passengers would come aboard this way. There's a sideboard because these rooms were used as pantries during the crossing, because you wouldn't need them for the passengers. They don't need to be in here. So it was good to use as a staging area for various things passengers might need in the reception. There's a hot plate there to keep things warm. Back here there's elevators and things. to get from deck to deck, and then we can head aft into the first-class dining saloon, which was, at the time, with space for well over 500 passengers, the largest dining room at sea. The detail in here is considerable, and it's possible that there may be a bit of lag in here. The largest table, as you can see, could seat 12. It's depicted in the movie as the table that the Caledon Hockley party dine at when they invite Jack up from steerage. But this room had two oak sort of bays on either end. One was used as a buffet, probably for desserts and things, and it's all illuminated with all this intricate carving, and there's drawers and cupboards underneath it. And at the other end, the forward end, since like the second-class dining saloon that we saw the other day, this room was used as a chapel on Sundays, with Protestant services presided over by Captain Smith, there is a piano here, both for the orchestra to play with or use during dinner, but then also for church service on Sundays. They had a piano available here. And then there's more buffet space on either side of that. We can just pick a random table here and take a look at what they ate on the 14th of April, 1912, which was obviously the last meal served in this room. There's lunch from April 14th here in the dining saloon, first class dining saloon. There's stained glass panels covering the windows. Let me see if our perspective is... There we go. And they were back illuminated at night. They've got one of them open so you can see the light bulbs in there. And there's a weird thing with the texture of these stained glass panels. They look gorgeous up close, but from far away there's like a weird glitch where the light from the portholes makes them do wormhole looking things. The developers are aware of that. There's a very famous Father Brown photograph. We'll see Father Brown's cabin and his camera later, but I believe it's taken from approximately here of this room on the 10th or 11th of April before he left the ship with everyone here for dinner. It's, I believe, the only photograph of this room. And then through the double doors that way, that's the galley, so stewards would bring food directly out through those doors and wander around bringing trolleys to whatever passengers may need. The ceiling texture and light fixtures here are all in 3D. They were not earlier, in earlier versions. And this is a discovery here that the development team of this project discovered years ago. In the movie, and in all earlier depictions of Titanic, these windows between the reception room and the dining saloon were oval-shaped arches, as they were on Olympic. But further examination of, I guess it's the Father Brown photo, so actually it would have been from that other end of the room looking this way, of the far background, because these are kind of obscured by people and pillars and everything going on, indicates that these windows were wider, so they're almost rectangular as depicted here. Probably. So that's sort of a novelty of the research done to support this project. Now we are going to head forward of here, past the elevator foyer, into the first class accommodation D-deck block. So there were cabins here, but I don't believe there's any cabins open. We're just using this hallway to get somewhere else that's kind of interesting. There were a handful of athletics facilities on board Titanic, including the swimming pool we've already seen. But down here, through that gate is just, I think, alternative first and second class cabins, but it's used as a passage to get to other parts of the ship, which is why it's left open. We can go down these stairs here And we're in a viewing gallery, or a very small viewing gallery, for the squash racquetball court, which you could reserve training sessions with a squash coach who is on board for the entertainment of the passengers. You could reserve times for matches in here. There's a ventilation shaft going all the way up in the ceiling. Light bulbs around the perimeter of the room here. But this is sort of a random novelty space on board Titanic. I don't know precisely how popular this was on the maiden voyage. We know at least some of the first class passengers did use it, but how frequently it was booked, we'll never know. We can head back out. This is one of the earliest first class accessible spaces to flood. It was even before midnight that this space was flooding. So we're going to go to one of the other crew spaces that we didn't catch during the actual crew portion of the tour. In this case, it's the post office and mail room. There were, I believe, 3 American and 2 British Royal mail clerks on board. And this was the room, the mail sorting room, the post office. So you can see there's all these sacks that are heading to different places. Mail's filed away, various postcards and letters and things. There's a hoist to move mail between the decks. Perhaps this is higher priority or government business mail. Behind this grate thing, it's in a cage. And then down here is the actual mail room. Now, this room was one of the first places where people were on a regular basis that was impacted by the iceberg collision. This place began to fill very quickly, very early on, and the mail clerks were hurriedly dragging all the mail sacks up to this deck and then up another flight of stairs. Here's the bottom of that lift and the mechanism for it. And John Thayer, a Pennsylvania railroad magnate, and his son, Jack Thayer, were, after the collision, doing their own little exploring. This was in the vicinity of midnight, so shortly after the actual iceberg collision, to try to figure out what was up, because they knew something was up. They felt the shudder, they felt the engines shut off, and they noticed the crew running around like chickens with their heads cut off, getting everything ready. So they came to the top of these stairs and looked down, and remember water swirling at the base, flooding the post office. We'll hear more about the Thayers later on in the tour. So this is the first class baggage hold. During the second class tour, I mistakenly mentioned that there were baggage hatches aft in the second class promenade. Those were actually here, further forward. This is the very bottom of those hatches. They can open and they bring mail down. Or not mail, baggage. And this is all first, maybe second class baggage in here, and there's another level down here that doesn't have any windows. This would also have flooded very early on after the collision. Then we can head back out of here, all the way out. Is that the door? It is. Apologize again for the loading screens here. first class is, again, a very, very detailed level. Alright, so we are going to head back upstairs towards the actual first class grand staircase, or I guess forward staircase as it was technically called. Grand was a term given to it in the fascination with the Titanic disaster that developed after she sank. We're going to head up to C deck here. Past all these probably placeholder paintings. I don't know that we have any evidence that A, there were paintings, or B, what they were. In here is the purser's office, so if you needed to check any of your valuables, this would be the office you'd do that in. There's a little window here, a desk, safe for transactions, safe for your actual money and jewels and heart of the ocean, things of that nature. And then these, I believe, are so that when the ship is rocking, you don't have this safe, like, tip forward and crush somebody to death, which would not be fun. And then I don't know which desk. One is for the chief purser and the other for the assistant purser. And I don't know which one is which, but somebody is drinking. So we'll leave that up for interpretation, precisely who's... Well, there's a phone here, so maybe this is the chief purser's desk. But this is the purser's office, and then directly next door was the inquiry office. If you needed anything during the voyage, a deck chair, cabin rearranging, reservations for the restaurant, ticket or reservations for the squash court or the swimming bath or the Turkish baths or anything, this would be where you would come. They would be able to help you out with that. The bulletin board here. Find owner of cufflink found in reception. Is there a cufflink? I don't see a cufflink. Anyway, here's the other end of the pneumatic tubes from the Marconi office. So you could also post a telegram in here. You could bring your message, and then it would be written up here in this office. They roll it up into the tube, they put it in the pneumatic system, shoots off to the Marconi office, and then that would be how the wireless operators would get it. Now, I think in the second class purser's office, they may not have had a pneumatic tube, and they just had to bring it directly to the Marconi office. Like, somebody from the second class purser's office would have to go do that. I don't know that for certain. Leaving the office here, we can head forward to cabin C8, which, while I don't believe we know who stayed in it, it does have a nice view forward and is sort of representative of a lot of standard first-class cabins that were available, which are oftentimes rather underwhelming compared to expectations for first-class cabins. So this is a little bit larger than standard. There'd be 3 people, or could be 3 people, 2 standard, 1 in the Pullman. There's wardrobe and wash basins and things. And you've got a rather odd, really low down view onto the well deck here, with the forward mast rising in the distance. There's that cabin. And then I don't remember if the lavatory is here. It must be B deck. So we will head further aft past the first class entrance, the landing of the grand staircase here. Got these 2 dual cherubs here, and the light fixtures. Oh, these are the queue dividers for the inquiry office, so they could set up lines here and wait for things. This room and the second class purser's office were both rushed in the early hour-ish of the sinking, once it became clear that an evacuation was underway as passengers tried to retrieve their valuables. I don't know how successful that was. And then we've got a notice board here. Passengers are encouraged to enjoy the sea trial, Titanic Project 401. Again, this is not a final version. There will be a version available on Steam with all sorts of historic and playable features. I'm going to head to this other side, because on this side of the ship is a very famous room. This is the Strauss sitting room. Now, the style of this room is going to look very familiar, because this was used by the Cameron film for the suite that the Caledon Hockley and DeWitt Bukater party stay in. That suite, B52, 54, 56, on B-Deck, was actually occupied by the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, and did not feature this decoration style. This is one of the Louis styles. And you can see there's the fireplace here, a watercolor panel above it, there's a very famous couch over there. But this room is not the one depicted in the film, because this is down on C deck rather than B deck. This room belonged to Ida and Isidore Strauss. Isidore was a Confederate veteran of the American Civil War, a former congressman, and the co-owner of Macy's department store. And he and his wife were traveling home to New York from Europe. They booked this suite. This would have been their bedroom, the pink carpet in here. And they are one of the more iconic stories of the Titanic disaster. They were both offered a position in one of the lifeboats. Here's the ensuite bathroom that they were in. And Isidore flatly refused to leave the ship before any of the other men were allowed off. And Ida flatly refused to leave the ship without her husband. I believe a paraphrase of the quote was, "We've been together for many years. Where you go, I go." They took up a position on a deck chair on the lifeboat deck and listened to the orchestra. We don't know precisely what happened to them, but neither of them survived the sinking. That was the Strauss sitting room and adjacent cabin. Across the hall, right here, is the cabin occupied by Ms. Ellen Bird and Mr. John Farthing, the two servants of the Strauss couple. What's interesting is not only were the two servants booked in first class, but they were booked in the same cabin, which would somewhat be unusual for a man and a woman who were not related to be booked in the same cabin. But I guess it was efficient. At least there's no evidence they were booked separately. They could have been, but this is where they're listed as staying. So, and there's two bumps in there, so it does, at least it's theoretically possible, and today wouldn't be particularly odd. I believe this is C-103, so this is the room of Elizabeth Bonnell, an English Unionist. She did survive the sinking. This was her cabin. You can read the notice, basically saying that since these cabins, they had like little latches, but they weren't technically locked. You were advised not to leave anything you felt particularly attached to in here, just in case, and to check all of that into the purser's office. into the safe. I don't think it was too common for there to be theft on board, but you never really know. So this was an identical cabin, C-105, and I don't think we had any occupant listed for that one, so we'll go to the port side, where you find C-70, which I believe is one of the Dutch interior styles. I don't know if this is modern Dutch or the other Dutch. There were like 3 Dutch styles of first class cabins, but this cabin belonged to John Thayer, the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who I mentioned earlier, going down to explore the mailroom as it flooded. He saw his wife and maid away in a boat, and then I believe he was reported last seen, quote unquote, by multiple different sources, but he was just standing on the boat deck quietly. He may have been smoking a cigarette. His son, Jack Thayer, did leap from the ship and eventually swam to a collapsible lifeboat. He did survive, and his rather detailed account lent to an artist on board Carpathia produced a sketch of the sinking, and a lot of what we know about the events of the sinking came from Jack Thayer, despite the fact that he may not have actually witnessed the final moments of the ship, as he was worried about getting on board a lifeboat. But this room, the colors in here are really nice. The painted ceiling, the inlay in the wooden doors here is all very... Those are kind of difficult to read. Stained glass covers for the windows. But we will move on here. C-120 is up next, which I believe are along the center line. Yes, so C-120, this cabin right here belonged to Mr. Sante Ringhini, who was a manservant to Mrs. Ella White and her traveling companion, Ms. Marie Young. They were booked in a cabin together, and the general consensus, and they could have just been very, very, very close friends, but the general historical consensus is they were probably a couple. But anyway, we can't access their cabin, but this one belonged to their manservant. There are 2 bunks in here, but I think it was just him. And Mrs. White and Ms. Young did survive. I don't believe Ringhini did, but I can look that up just to be sure. And the cabin next door is just an identical one. I don't think we have an occupant listed. We can continue to head. I think this is aft. There's a linen closet here. There were linen storage spaces all over the place, but stewards might need bed sheets or towels, and this type of space would be where they would get them. And then here on the starboard side is cabin number C-73, which is significant. Not necessarily, I think it was actually unoccupied on the crossing, but it was occupied in a different sense. In 1996, this was before I was born, so there's that, there was a computer game, a point-and-click computer game, called Titanic Adventure Out of Time. And the player stayed in this cabin. Now, in the movie, the video game, it's an entirely different style. It's closer to the Sprouse sitting room in interior decor. This is what this room actually looked like, but the developers of this game have included a prop from Adventure Out of Time. So there's this trunk here with a phonograph and an Enigma machine. I doubt anyone listening to this or watching this ever played Adventure Out of Time, and I don't know if it's even still available. It might be on Steam, a ported version of it. Because it was originally like a CD-ROM that you could buy in a store, those really old days. But this would be the character's cabin from Adventure Out of Time, so that's kind of fun. We can head further aft. Oh, I did. So this little tiny dining room belonged to the postal workers who worked down the mailroom we've already seen, and the Marconi operators from the wireless office on the boat deck in the officers' quarters. They would eat in here. They had their own little dining room. There's a portrait of King George there, and across the room, a portrait of Guglielmo Marconi, the founder of the wireless telegraphy company that manufactured Titanic's equipment. So this was the little dining room for them. Various nautically inspired paintings on the walls here. And next door is the dining saloon for the maids and valets that first and second class passengers might bring with them. They wouldn't dine in the first class dining saloon because that would be kind of odd to have the servants dining with their employers. So they had their own dining saloon here on the sea deck, and I believe they were given the same food service as was provided to the dining saloon proper. It's just in a different room. You can see the paneling is quite nice in here, actually, although there is a bare steel ceiling, but that's not uncommon even in first-class cabins. And then adjacent to that, we have this pantry space, which serviced the maids and valet saloon. So this would be the food preparation and plating, and there'd be coffee and tea available in here that the stewards could bring out. And there's little serving windows, so that the stewards would grab it out, walk into the saloon to hand it out to people, and that kind of thing. Kind of fun to have these surface spaces also visible to really get an idea of how everything functioned. Moving even further aft, we're now in the sea deck landing of the aft grand staircase, the second of the two first-class main stairwells. There's an entrance to the maids and valets saloon here at that end, but also the barber shop. This entire room and everything above and below it was completely obliterated during the breakup and scattered across the seabed in the debris field. And this barber pole, was seen floating on the surface the next morning. But here's the barber shop. I think the barber would probably sleep in here on this sofa. But in addition to getting a haircut or a shave or whatever else you might need, there would also have been little pendants and stuffed toys and souvenirs and things for sale in here. So, to remember the voyage, you could come in here and buy a trinket of some sort. They're not represented yet, but I imagine they will eventually be visible in here. There's the barber shop. It didn't have constant hours. The barber needs to sleep and eat at some point, but there's the barber shop. And then moving further forward, or aft, we have C-142, which is the cabin of a Mr. Austin partner, who was a stockbroker traveling to Canada on business. This was his tiny little cabin, so even in first class, you didn't necessarily have all that much space. He did not survive the sinking, and I believe his body was eventually recovered by the cable ship Mackay Bennett, which was chartered by White Star to begin recovery efforts out in the Atlantic in the weeks after the disaster. Still further aft, sort of the last segment in this part before I think we break it up into a volume 2, if you will, of first class, since there's so much in first class to see. Down this hallway is a number of high-ranking crew cabins. They're basically officers, they're just not quartered in the officer's deck house. We have here the cabin of the chief first class steward, a Mr. Andrew Latimer. This was his cabin. He had a window looking out into the second class, partially enclosed promenade there, and a little office desk and things. The lights are off in here, so it's very dark and hard to see, but this was Mr. Latimer's cabin. He did go down with the ship. His wife, Janet Latimer, was pregnant at the time. She later gave birth to their son, who she named Andrew after him. Next door is the restaurant manager, Luigi Gatti. The a la carte restaurant, which we haven't seen yet, was operated almost as a separate business to the ship. The staff were not crew, they were employed by Gatti and his restaurant management firm, I guess you could say. He had a couple dozen staff members. I don't believe many of them at all survived. Gatti and most of his staff went down with the ship. I think that was, if I remember right, mostly because of the vast miscommunication about what was going on with the restaurant staff. But anyway, this was his room. Next door to him was the assistant doctor, John Simpson, who would be the chief surgeon for second class, but assistant to the actual chief surgeon. This was his cabin, standard compared to the other two. Simpson did go down with the ship. He was a captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps. And next door to that, well, look around the corner here? Ah, yes, is the chief surgeon, Dr. William O'Loughlin. So he had a much more extensive office, because any first-class passenger that might need his services could come here and be seen by the doctor, and he could figure out what was going wrong with them and see what he could do about fixing it. So he had this office and then a curtain to cordon off his personal sleeping quarters. Dr. O'Loughlin was also lost on the night of the sinking. A lot of these men were actually last seen together on the boat deck after assisting in the evacuation, but precisely what happened to them is unclear. And then the last place we'll see before we move into the next part of the tour is the ship's hospital. There are two parts that I want to point out down here, since a lot of it is still closed off, but it's down sort of below the doctor's cabin. Got a nice view out to the ocean there. Now, we saw the Master-at-Arms' cabin in an earlier part of the tour, where in the movie they chain up Jack after he steals something, or at least supposedly steals something and whatnot. Well, there wasn't room in the Master-at-Arms' cabin, so they would have had to put unruly passengers if they existed somewhere else. The ship was fitted in here in the hospital with a padded room, which, in addition for anyone deemed insane, since the ship didn't have a brig, this would probably be where they would put them, and sort of keep them until they could be dealt with more well-equipped authorities ashore. And then in addition to that, there was an infectious hospital on board, so if something particularly catchy were to get out, those passengers would be separated from the rest of the passenger accommodation and kept here until arrival either on the eastern or western side of the Atlantic. They had their own private bath facilities to keep them separate as well. And then the rest of the hospital isn't quite available yet. But I think in order to facilitate this not taking really, really lengthy periods of time, we'll see the rest of the first class, primarily public rooms and a couple of the major, rather well-known suites in another video, so that we don't end up going too long. But that was the first part, the first volume, if you will, of first class on board RMS Titanic. As you can see, from what we've already seen, it is a step up dramatically from the first two classes on board, and easily lends itself to the idea that Titanic was, at least for a short time, the most luxurious ship ever built. So I think we'll leave it there, and I will see everybody in the actual final part of our tour of Titanic. Thank you much for watching.